They say you can tell a lot about a person by the shoes they wear. If you glance down at Samuel Carter's feet that day, you'd see worn-out work boots, their soles roughened by years of walking through freshly tilled earth. He was an unassuming man, clad in a pair of faded denim overalls and a plain white t-shirt. His skin, a deep, warm bronze, was marked by decades under the unforgiving sun. His hands were rough, calloused, the hands of someone who worked with soil, pruning shears, and hope. Samuel didn't seem like someone who belonged in first class. But assumptions, as we all know, can be costly. The mistake made that day by a flight attendant named Kimberly was one she would never forget. It would cost her more than a few sleepless nights. It would cost her everything she thought she had worked so hard for. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Samuel Carter had spent his life creating beauty for others. At 65 years old, he was the head gardener at the estate of one of the most powerful men in America, Leonard Blackstone, CEO of Apex Air. For over 2 decades, Samuel had turned Blackstone's sprawling estate into a paradise of roses, fountains, and living sculptures. And Blackstone respected him deeply. On a bright Thursday morning, Samuel arrived at the regional airport, ticket in hand, bound for Miami. He was attending his niece's wedding, a joyous event he hadn't dared imagine he'd find time for. Leonard, hearing Samuel speak fondly of his family, had insisted on gifting him something special, a first-class ticket aboard an Apex Air flight. "You've earned it, Sam," Leonard had said. "Take the seat. It's yours." Samuel, humble as ever, had initially resisted. But he accepted the gift in the end. What he hadn't expected was how others would react to him accepting it. The airport terminal bustled with activity. Samuel found his gate, his simple duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His cap bore the logo of a local landscaping company, though he'd never worked for them. It was just a hat that kept the sun out of his eyes. As Samuel approached the boarding lane for first class, he noticed the stares. Some were curious, others dismissive. He paid them no mind. He had weathered worse storms. And then came Kimberly. Kimberly Davis was everything Apex Air wanted in a flight attendant, at least on the surface. Tall, blonde, and always immaculate in her presentation. Her navy uniform was pressed to perfection, her scarf tied just so. But beneath the polish was a simmering ambition. She wasn't here to serve. She was here to climb. She didn't view passengers as people, more like stepping stones. Some were to be polished, others to be avoided entirely. When her eyes landed on Samuel, her brow lifted in thinly veiled skepticism. "May I see your boarding pass, sir?" she asked, her tone practiced but cool. Samuel offered a warm smile and handed her his ticket. It was slightly crumpled from being in his pocket. Kimberly's eyes flickered as she read the seat assignment. 2A. First class. Her lips pursed, confusion flashing across her face before she masked it with a tight smile. "First class, Mr. Carter?" she asked, as though testing him. "Yes, ma'am," he replied calmly. "That's right." Kimberly nodded stiffly. "One moment, please," she said, stepping aside to confer with another flight attendant. Samuel overheard whispers. Upgrade. Mistake economy. He sighed softly. Patience. That's what his mother had taught him. Patience was a gardener's greatest virtue. When Kimberly returned, she pasted on another thin smile. "Mr. Carter," she said, "there seems to be some confusion with your booking. Would you mind showing me your identification?" "Of course," Samuel said. He produced his driver's license without hesitation. Kimberly typed furiously into her tablet. Another attendant, a junior named Lila, leaned over her shoulder, confirming the seat assignment. Kimberly handed the ID back. "Everything appears to be in order. Please enjoy your flight," she said, her voice brittle. Samuel nodded politely. "Thank you." As he made his way to his seat, he heard Kimberly mutter, "I don't know what's happening to this airline these days." Passengers exchanged glances. Some smirked. Others looked away. Samuel sat into, adjusting his duffel under the seat in front of him. The leather was soft. Too soft for him, perhaps. He'd spent his life flying coach, sometimes not flying at all. But Leonard had insisted. and Samuel wasn't one to argue with the man who'd trusted him with his most prized gardens. Across the aisle, a businessman stared. A woman in pearls pretended not to notice him. But Samuel noticed them. He just chose not to care. The plane's departure was delayed briefly, and the mood on board grew tense. Samuel kept his eyes on his book, a detective novel he'd been reading. But the air felt heavy. Kimberly lingered in the galley, speaking with the chief purser, Robert Stanton. "He doesn't belong up here," she hissed. "He's wearing overalls and work boots." Robert frowned. "The manifest says 2A. The payment cleared. You don't get to decide who belongs." But Kimberly was unconvinced. "We have CEOs and politicians in first class, Robert. He's tracking dirt on the carpet." Robert gave her a hard look. "Treat him with respect. That's your job." Still, the seed had been planted in Kimberly's mind. She saw Samuel as a stain on her perfect cabin. Service began after takeoff. Kimberly glided down the aisle, smiling at passengers, complimenting ties and jewelry. When she reached Samuel, her smile tightened again. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, clipped. "Water, please," Samuel said kindly. She returned with a bottle of sparkling water, setting it down without a word. With other passengers, she'd offered choices of lemon or lime, hot towels, and mixed nuts. With Samuel, none of that. He sighed, but said nothing. Some people needed longer to grow. The turbulence struck about 20 minutes into the flight. Samuel braced himself as the plane shuddered. He'd survived worse storms on the ground. Once things settled, the cabin resumed its hum of quiet conversation. A young woman across the aisle leaned over. "Excuse me," she said shyly. "Are you Samuel Carter, the gardener at Blackstone Manor?" Samuel smiled. "I am." Her face lit up. "I work in PR for Apex Enterprises. We've featured your gardens in our marketing materials." Before he could reply, Kimberly swooped in. "Ma'am, can I get you anything?" she interrupted sharply. The woman shook her head, confused. Kimberly forced a smile and turned to Samuel. "We'll be serving lunch shortly." When meal service began, Kimberly offered other passengers choices. But when she reached Samuel, she plopped down a tray without asking. "Here you go," she said curtly. Samuel glanced at the chicken dish. "Was there a salmon option?" he asked gently. "We're out," Kimberly lied. Moments later, Samuel watched another passenger receive salmon. His stomach tightened, not from hunger but from disappointment. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Jonathan Reyes received a priority message from corporate. The CEO himself had called. Leonard Blackstone. A brief conversation later, Robert Stanton was summoned. Captain Reyes explained the situation. "Passenger in 2A, Reyes said. Leonard's friend. Complaint about discriminatory treatment." Robert's face paled. "Kimberly, she's walking a thin line," Reyes said. "Fix it. Now." Robert confronted Kimberly quietly in the galley. "Corporate knows." The CEO himself called. Kimberly's face drained of color. "I was only doing my job." "You were judging a man by his clothes," Robert said coldly. "Make it right, or pack your things." Kimberly approached Samuel again. "Mr. Carter," she said stiffly. "I apologize if our service hasn't met your expectations. We value all first-class passengers." Samuel looked at her calmly. "Thank you." But the damage was done, and others had noticed. The rest of the flight was uneventful. But when they landed in Miami, 3 people from Apex Air's executive team were waiting. "Mr. Carter," one of them, Marissa Cole, introduced herself. "Chief of Operations. Mr. Blackstone asked us to meet you." Samuel sighed. That wasn't necessary. He insisted. Behind them, Kimberly exited the plane with Robert. Marissa addressed them sternly. "We need to debrief. Now." Samuel watched Kimberly's pale face as she was led away. His heart was heavy. He hadn't wanted this. Later, in the Apex VIP lounge, Marissa thanked Samuel for his honesty. "This isn't the first complaint against MS. Davis," she said. "She'll be suspended, likely terminated." Samuel exhaled. "I didn't want to ruin her career." "We understand," Marissa said. "But our standards are clear." Samuel eventually made it to the wedding. His family embraced him with love and laughter. He chose to leave the flight story behind, focusing on the joy of seeing his niece marry. But days later, he met Leonard Blackstone for dinner. Leonard apologized again, but Samuel shook his head. "I'm grateful," Samuel said, "but I hope Kimberly learns something." "She will," Leonard assured him, "or she won't work in this industry again." Samuel's return flight was peaceful. The crew welcomed him warmly. The new lead attendant, Jerome, treated him with respect, hanging his cap and offering him his choice of meals. Samuel smiled quietly. Perhaps the storm had passed. Back at Blackstone Manor, Samuel returned to his gardens. But something had changed. He walked taller. His quiet dignity had bloomed into a deep understanding. We all deserve respect, no matter our clothes, our titles, or our work. And sometimes, sitting in your rightful seat is the strongest statement you can make.